My name is Judge Boyd, and I've sat on this bench for over 30 years now. Today, I want to tell you about a case that completely upended everything I thought I understood about the law, about justice, and about the raw reality of human nature when it walks into my courtroom. In 3 decades, I've heard every imaginable excuse a human mind can invent to explain away the worst moment of their life. I learned early in my career to separate elaborate performance from naked truth by instinct, by psychological patterns, and by the thousands of microscopic tells that practiced liars can never quite hide. I honestly believed nothing could surprise me anymore. I was profoundly wrong. On an ordinary Tuesday morning in October, a young man named Julian walked into my courtroom for what the docket listed as a routine probate and estate hearing. But by the time he left, a $100 million fortune was abandoned. A horrific secret spanning a decade hidden behind prestigious child charities was exposed, and a sophisticated crime network officially collapsed. It remains the single most important case of my career, not because of the astronomical sum of money, but because of what it laid bare about the systems meant to protect vulnerable orphans like him, and how completely those systems had failed. Julian was 21, frail, wearing a worn-out jacket, yet standing with an absolute stiffness. He projected a profound stillness that most people would mistake for calm. It isn't calm, it's the silence of someone who trained himself never to react, because reacting once in his past had cost him everything. On paper, he stood before me as the sole legal heir to an eccentric billionaire who had recently died in a highly suspicious accident. $100 million is a catastrophic figure capable of turning an unprotected orphan into a person of supreme influence with the stroke of a pen. Everyone in the gallery assumed this was a fortunate, dry formality. None of us knew that behind that mountain of wealth lay a trail of blood. The hearing began like thousands of others. His court-appointed attorney, a middle-aged man named Elliot, stepped forward with an expression of immense relief, believing he was helping a boy open a wealthy new chapter. I checked the legal pages, verified the official seals, and prepared to lower my gavel to close the matter permanently. By mandatory protocol, before delivering the final judgment, I looked directly at Julian. Mr. Julian, do you have anything you wish to state before this court officially recognizes your ownership of this estate? Julian stood up very slowly. He gripped the edge of the wooden defense table with his thin hands, lifted his head, and locked his eyes onto mine without a shred of hesitation. The massive courtroom suddenly fell into a suffocating silence, so dense that the only sound was the rhythmic clicking of the court reporter's keys. Then he spoke, his voice chillingly clear. Your Honor, before you sign those papers, I think you should know the truth. I completely refuse this money. I will not accept a single penny of that $100 million, and I am here to tell you why. The exact second those words were uttered, the room's temperature plummeted. The silence turned into a heavy, breathless tension. Elliot practically leaped from his chair in sheer panic. Julian, are you out of your mind? Please, stop talking right now. He spun toward my bench, stammering. Your Honor, my client is currently not in a stable mental state to make a binding legal decision of this magnitude. Elliot tried to pull Julian's arm, but Julian firmly brushed his hand away. His gaze remained unbreakably locked onto mine, the look of a man who had rehearsed this confession alone in the dark for thousands of nights, waiting for the light of justice to finally expose the truth. I raised my hand, a sharp gesture forcing the attorney to step back. Mr. Elliot, I said, my voice dropping into a low command. Your client is of legal age and has the right to speak, but I want him to understand precisely what that means first. I looked at Julian directly, delivering a grave warning. Julian, this becomes part of the permanent legal record. Once I sign your refusal, this fortune will be frozen and permanently forfeited, regardless of how tragic the story is. Are you absolutely certain you want to walk away? Julian didn't blink. His jaw tightened. I understand the consequences, Your Honor. I spent 15 years living a lie just to survive. I pretended to be a grateful adopted son while watching the monsters who ran those charities destroy the lives of helpless children just like me. Today, I am done being silent. This $100 million isn't an inheritance. It is a massive bloodstain. I nodded once, firmly. Then the court is listening. The courtroom held its breath, and the horrific truth officially began to unfold. The silence that followed Julian's declaration didn't just linger. It pressed down on the room like a physical weight. Assistant District Attorney Nair was already on her feet, her fingers tapping a furious rhythm on her phone, alerting her supervisors. Beside Julian, Elliot Cho looked as though he had been struck by lightning. His hands were visibly trembling as he rearranged papers he no longer had the focus to read. But Julian remained completely unmoved. He kept his eyes locked on me, waiting for the moment he had spent his entire life preparing to receive. Your Honor, Julian began, his voice maintaining that icy, unnatural composure that sends chills down a seasoned judge's spine. The man who signed that will, Arthur Vance, was celebrated as a saint. The media called him the billionaire godfather of the fatherless. They threw gala dinners in his honor, took photos of him holding the hands of smiling children at his foundations, and praised his unmatched generosity. But I lived inside his estate for 12 years. I wasn't his adopted son. I was his ultimate camouflage. He paused, his thin fingers tightening against the dark oak table until his knuckles turned completely white. Arthur Vance did not build a charity empire to save children. He built a global money-washing machine that utilized the identities of thousands of untraceable orphans to hide capital from international arms deals and human procurement networks. That $100 million sitting in your court escrow right now is the clean interest generated by an ocean of human suffering. A sharp gasp echoed from the gallery. I raised my hand slightly, a silent warning that kept the room from descending into chaos. As a judge, you learn to read human anatomy under pressure. People who lie under oath lean into hyperbole. Their eyes dart, their posture shifts. They explain trivialities to buy time. Julian did none of these things. He stood perfectly straight, delivering facts with the clinical precision of a coroner reading an autopsy report. When I was 6 years old, Julian continued, I was brought to the Vance estate. As the Kitsiketso, the outside world, it looked like an elite paradise. We had private tutors and a sprawling playground, but the windows didn't open from the inside. The security guards didn't look out to protect us. They looked inward to ensure no one ever communicated with the outside world. We were props. Whenever an international auditor or a prominent politician visited, we were brought out to smile and recite pre-written speeches about how the foundation saved our lives. If you forgot a line, you were moved to the lower basement units where the lights never turned off, and you stayed there until you learned how to perform without error. I looked over at Assistant District Attorney Nair. Her pen had stopped moving entirely. The defensive, adversarial posture she had maintained at the start of the morning had completely dissolved, replaced by a rigid, hyper-focused attention. In my 30 years on the bench, I have watched hundreds of individuals try to fake trauma. They weep excessively. They pause for calculated dramatic effect. They look around to see if the gallery is watching their performance. Julian did none of that. His voice remained steady, flat, and dangerously clear, the voice of a young man who had already processed his terror years ago and was now simply delivering the cold, final inventory of a broken system. Your Honor, Julian continued, his eyes reflecting the harsh fluorescent lights of the courtroom. Arthur Vance was careful, but he made one fatal mistake. He assumed that because we were children, we were blind. He assumed that because we had no families, no one would ever listen to our voices if we spoke out. When I turned 16, because I had proven myself exceptionally quiet and compliant, I was assigned to work in his private residential study. My job was simple on the surface: shredding old operational logs, sorting incoming international wire transfers, and cataloging the passport photos of children who entered the foundations but never actually appeared on the public registries. Julian took a slow, deliberate breath. The courtroom was so quiet you could hear the faint, rhythmic hum of the air conditioning vents high above. It took me 3 years to realize what those registries actually meant. Every time a child arrived from a conflict zone, their legal identity was registered under a ghost charity account. Vance would spin up a shell company in an offshore tax haven, assign a multi-million-dollar endowment to that child's name as a special care fund, and then systematically move those funds out into European real estate portfolios. The children themselves were quietly moved to secondary, unmonitored facilities across state lines. The money remained, perfectly laundered, fully protected by the legal shield of a registered American nonprofit. Elliot Cho leaned forward, his voice barely a whisper. Julian, tell the judge about the ledger. Julian looked directly at me. I didn't just watch, Your Honor. Every night after the mansion went dark, I returned to that study. I didn't use a phone to take pictures. The security network would have flagged the digital signature instantly. Instead, I memorized the routing numbers, the bank codes, and the specific shell companies. I wrote them down on the margins of my old school textbooks, hiding the pages beneath the floorboards of the old greenhouse behind the estate. For 5 years, I built an unassailable financial map of Arthur Vance's true empire, and that map is exactly why he is dead today, and why I am standing before you refusing to touch a single dollar of his corrupted legacy. The moment the word ledger left Julian's lips, Assistant District Attorney Nair rose swiftly to her feet. Procedurally, her objection was textbook clear. Your Honor, she stated, her voice tight with uncharacteristic urgency, this court is currently convened for a routine probate verification. The alleged financial malfeasance or operational structure of the Vance Foundations falls entirely outside the purview of this civil docket. I must object to any further testimony that deviates from the execution of the deceased's lawful will. It was a clean, fair, legal argument. Under normal circumstances, any judge sitting on this bench would have sustained it without a second thought. But 30 years in this black robe have taught me that when the law is weaponized as a shield to choke out a terrifying truth, a judge's primary moral duty is to lower that shield. Overruled. Miss Nair, I said, my voice echoing off the paneled walls. If this estate is indeed built upon systemic criminal architecture, this court will not act as its administrative rubber stamp. Mr. Julian. Continue. Nair sat down slowly, her posture rigid. She no longer looked at her legal files. Instead, her eyes shifted toward the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the courtroom, as if expecting an invisible threat to walk through them. And right on cue, the doors swung open. A man in a sharp gray suit stepped into the gallery, moving with the quiet, deliberate gravity of federal authority. He approached the bar, bypassing the spectators, and presented his credentials directly to my bailiff. Special Agent Marcus, Internal Revenue Service, Criminal Investigation Division. Your Honor, Agent Marcus said quietly. Addressing the bench, my task force has spent 4 years attempting to penetrate the offshore financial networks of the Vance Foundations. We have been systematically stonewalled by shell entities in Panama, erased records, and a highly protective wall of elite corporate lobbyists. We flagged this probate hearing through an automated court monitoring system, expecting a routine asset transfer. We did not expect the master key to the entire empire to be sitting at the defense table. I looked from the federal agent back to the frail young man standing before me. Julian looked at Agent Marcus, but there was no fear in his eyes. There was only the cold, calculated satisfaction of an architect who had patiently waited in the dark for the demolition crew to finally arrive with the proper tools. The floorboards in the old greenhouse, Julian said, his voice dangerously calm and carrying across the silent room. They don't just hold random notes, Agent Marcus. They hold the precise routing numbers and encrypted SWIFT transaction codes for the Swiss bank accounts that funded Arthur Vance's true operations. I knew you were looking for them. I kept them safe for you. The atmosphere in the room fractured completely. We were no longer evaluating a dead man's wealth or discussing a simple inheritance. We were witnessing the meticulous, cold execution of a multi-year trap designed by an unprotected orphan, carried out right in front of the very judicial system that had completely failed to protect him in the first place. The revelation of the hidden codes transformed my courtroom from a place of civil arbitration into a high-stakes legal flashpoint. Agent Marcus immediately stepped toward the gallery railing, speaking in muted, urgent tones into his phone, activating a federal field team located 3 states away. Beside him, Assistant District Attorney Nair sat completely motionless, her gaze fixed on the floorboards, as if realizing for the first time that the walls of institutional protection around the Vance empire were entirely hollow. In my 30 years on the bench, I have watched powerful institutions try to suppress individual voices by relying on complexity. They use infinite layers of corporate entities, expensive legal counsel, and the sheer intimidation of bureaucracy to make a victim feel small, isolated, and insignificant. They assume that an unprotected individual will eventually break under the weight of the system, but they always forget one fundamental law of human psychology. A person who has already lost everything has nothing left to fear. Julian stood by the defense table, his posture unchanged, watching the sudden flurry of federal activity with an expression of detached certainty. He wasn't acting out of panic or a sudden impulse for revenge. Every movement, every syllable he delivered had been meticulously calculated over years of silent observation. "You see, Your Honor," Julian said, his voice cutting through the rising murmur of the gallery, "Arthur Vance kept me close because he believed my silence was guaranteed by my dependency. He thought that by providing an elite education, he had bought my complicity. He genuinely believed that a child who had seen the dark underbelly of his empire would eventually choose the comfort of wealth over the pain of truth. He measured my loyalty by the size of the inheritance he wrote into his will." I leaned forward, looking closely at the young man. "Julian," I asked, ensuring my voice carried the full weight of the bench, "when did you realize that keeping this secret would eventually destroy you?" He looked directly at me, and for a fleeting second, the icy mask slipped, revealing the raw, unhealed wound of a child who had been forced to grow up far too fast. "The night I turned 18, Your Honor. A young girl from a foreign conflict zone was brought to the estate. Her papers said she was an international scholar, funded by the foundation, but she was terrified. When I tried to hand her a glass of water, one of the private security guards pushed me back and told me to mind my own business if I wanted to keep my name on the legacy registry. That was the exact moment I realized that my comfort was being paid for with the lives of others. That was the night I decided that Arthur Vance's empire had to burn, and I was going to be the one to light the match." The tension inside the courtroom snapped from abstract speculation into immediate, undeniable consequence. Agent Marcus had stepped away to the back corridor, his low, authoritative murmurs into his secure line, signaling the shifting of massive, multi-jurisdictional federal gears. Back at the defense table, Elliot Cho sat with his mouth slightly open, the realization washing over him that his client had not just brought a grievance to a local probate court, he had brought a tactical execution to a corporate empire. In my 3 decades on this bench, I have watched countless individuals try to leverage unverified claims to escape their circumstances or seek desperate retribution. They bring half-baked rumors, emotional outbursts, and conspiracy theories, expecting the majesty of the law to fight their personal battles for them. But the law does not operate on emotion. It operates on the cold, heavy weight of verifiable documentation. When Julian spoke of the floorboards in the old greenhouse, he wasn't just telling a story. He was presenting the exact structural vulnerability of a financial network that had successfully insulated itself from every high-level regulatory audit for over a generation. "Your Honor," Julian continued, his voice dropping into an even deeper, more resonant quietude that filled every corner of the high-ceilinged room. "They spent millions of dollars building digital firewalls, paying off compliance officers, and ensuring that every single electronic footprint left by Arthur Vance's shell corporations was scrubbed within 24 hours of a transaction. They thought they had built a digital fortress, but they forgot that a fortress still requires human hands to maintain the physical records. They forgot that every time an international wire transfer stalled, a physical confirmation slip was generated and left on the study desk. I didn't steal those slips. I just read them. Every single night for 5 years, I read the names of the banks in Zurich, the routing numbers in Cyprus, and the registration codes of the private assets used to move untraceable wealth." Assistant District Attorney Nair slowly put her pen down on her legal pad. The adversarial posture she had held tightly since 9 o'clock that morning completely dissolved. She looked at Julian not as a disruptive element on her morning docket, but as a living, breathing systemic failure that was currently dismantling an untouchable legacy right in front of her eyes. "Your Honor," she said, her voice unusually quiet as she addressed the bench, "if the federal authorities verify even a fraction of what this young man is claiming, the district attorney's office will immediately move to freeze all assets connected to the Vance estate under state racketeering laws. This probate proceeding can no longer continue under standard protocols." I looked at the clock on the back wall. It was barely 11 in the morning, yet an entire lifetime of institutional assumptions was collapsing inside room 302. "The motion to stall the asset transfer is granted, Miss Nair," I stated, my gavel resting lightly in my palm. "But this court will remain in session." "Julian, You have systematically unraveled the framework of your own inheritance. Tell me what happened when Arthur Vance discovered that his perfect camouflage had developed a conscience. Julian's hands finally released their grip on the wooden table. He stood completely detached, an orphan who had finally stepped out from the shadow of a giant. He didn't discover it, Your Honor, Julian said, a cold smile touching his lips. He died believing he had won. He died believing I was still his silent property. Your Honor, Julian said, his voice dropping into a register that was entirely devoid of theatrical anger, carrying only the terrifying weight of absolute certainty. People always want a dramatic version of a reckoning, a grand, cinematic showdown where the villain begs for mercy or screams in defiance. But systemic corruption doesn't collapse that way. Arthur Vance spent his final night alive, sitting in his leather armchair, surrounded by the legal frameworks of his newest offshore acquisition, sipping scotch as if he were completely untouchable. He looked at me, a young man he believed he had successfully molded into a silent asset, and told me that the world belongs to those who know how to engineer the rules, not those who are foolish enough to follow them. He truly believed that my compliance had been permanently bought and paid for by the luxury of the estate. He had absolutely no idea that while he was signing those acquisition papers, I had already transmitted the mirror image of his entire encrypted financial architecture to 3 separate international regulatory bodies. The courtroom remained completely dead silent. Even the rhythmic clicking of the court reporter's machine seemed to slow down, capturing every syllable of a demolition that had been 12 years in the making. Assistant District Attorney Nair sat perfectly still, her legal pad completely abandoned, realizing that this probate hearing was no longer an administrative procedure. It was the official public reading of an execution order for a multi-billion-dollar corporate myth. When I told him what I had done, Julian continued, his eyes reflecting the cold light of the room. He didn't scream. He didn't call for his private residential security guards. He just sat there, staring at me, his face losing its color as the absolute reality of his exposure settled into his chest. The chest pains started less than 5 minutes later. The medical examiners ultimately ruled his death a natural cardiac event brought on by sudden, acute stress. I never touched him, Your Honor. I didn't have to. The weight of his own exposed truth did the work for me, and that is precisely why I am standing before you today. This $100 million inheritance isn't a gift. It is the final anchor of a sinking ship. If I accept even a single dollar of it, I become an active component of the machinery that kept those children hidden in the dark. I am not here to claim a legacy. I am here to cut the anchor. Agent Marcus stepped forward from the back of the bar, holding a secure federal tablet that was actively flashing with real-time field updates. Your Honor, the federal agent stated, his voice cutting through the heavy atmosphere. Our administrative field teams have just confirmed the structural location of the secondary unmonitored facilities based on the data stream Mr. Julian provided to our network 10 minutes ago. Federal warrants are being executed across state lines at this exact moment. The ghost registry is officially compromised. I looked down from the bench at the frail young man standing at the defense table. In 30 years as a judge, I have handed down thousands of complex verdicts, but I have never once witnessed a cleaner, more calculated execution of absolute accountability carried out by an individual whom the official protective systems had completely left behind. The law is a slow, heavy, mechanical engine, often far too bureaucratic to notice the suffering trapped inside its own gears. But on this Tuesday morning, the engine had finally been forced to listen. The formal closure of that session was not met with the typical bureaucratic indifference that usually accompanies the end of a civil docket. As I looked down at the signed decree resting on my bench, officially recording Julian's absolute waiver of the $100 million estate, I knew I was looking at a historic turning point for our judicial district. The money did not disappear into the void of state bureaucracy. Under the precise legal provisions triggered by Julian's ironclad documentation and Agent Marcus's immediate federal intervention, the entirety of the Vance fortune was permanently seized under racketeering laws. It was systematically redirected into a secured, court-monitored restitution trust dedicated entirely to the medical rehabilitation, education, and long-term protection of the children rescued from the ghost registries. Justice, in its truest and most elegant form, had used the very wealth meant to hide a criminal empire to permanently dismantle it. Julian stood at the defense table as the gallery began to clear out. He didn't look like a victor celebrating a monumental financial or legal win. He looked like a young man who had finally been permitted to lay down a suffocating, crushing burden he had carried alone in the dark for 12 long years. He looked up at the bench, gave a slight, respectful nod of his head, and turned to walk out of room 302. He stepped out into a world where his identity, his future, and his name finally belonged entirely to him, completely free from the toxic shadow of Arthur Vance. In the months that followed, his actions forced a total systemic overhaul within our state's charitable oversight divisions, establishing strict, unannounced independent audits for every major nonprofit operating within our jurisdiction. I helped draft those regulatory frameworks myself, and it remains the most vital contribution I have ever made outside of this courtroom. This case didn't alter my fundamental belief in the rule of law, but it deeply transformed my understanding of what the law is meant to achieve. The law is often dry, slow, and mechanically rigid, structured to prioritize procedural compliance over raw human reality. It is a system built for numbers and dockets, easily blinded by the polished performance of wealthy elites. But Julian taught me that sometimes the most profound act of justice a judge can perform is to step away from the mechanical paperwork, silence the technical objections, and simply listen to the truth all the way to the end before deciding what justice actually requires. Arthur Vance built a multi-million-dollar corporate myth, believing that money could buy permanent silence and absolute power. He forgot that the most dangerous vulnerability to any corrupt system is a single human conscience that refuses to be bought. Julian didn't come to my courtroom to be saved by the law. By the time he reached my defense table, he had already saved himself and thousands of others through his own calculated courage. All I did on that ordinary Tuesday morning was set the paperwork aside and ensure that the world was finally forced to stand still and listen to him say so.